Neveah Dawson was 10 years old when a math professor told her the problem was impossible. The whole class laughed until she stood up and solved it in silence. But instead of applause, he picked up the eraser and wiped away her proof. No credit. No questions. Just chalk dust and humiliation. Beat soft rise in music. But someone was recording. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The brick and glass facade of the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute gleamed under the early June sun, its clean lines and polished corridors promising opportunity to the gifted, or at least to those who looked the part. Inside, the air was cold with calculation. Everything about the place was measured. The steps between classrooms, the rigid syllabi, the perfectly timed bell system, and presiding over it all was Professor Raymond Colton. To the public, Colton was an academic star, a tenured math scholar, with a string of published journals, lecture invitations from Ivy League campuses, and a knack for shaping high-performing minds. But behind his reputation was a man whose precision extended not only to equations, but to assumptions. In his world, genius wore khakis, had pale skin, and came from the right zip codes. The rest, exceptions at best, liabilities at worst. That morning, the Advanced Summer Seminar for Exceptional Youth had just begun. It was invitation only. 20 students selected from a nationwide pool of applicants, narrowed down by test scores, recommendation letters, and an unspoken but ever-present pedigree filter. Most came from private academies, magnet schools, or elite suburban districts. And then there was Neveah Dawson. She walked in wearing a faded pink hoodie, braided hair pulled into two tight buns, and a cheap spiral notebook clutched tightly to her chest. Her glasses slid down her nose every few seconds, and her backpack had one broken zipper. But behind her nervous eyes was a mind that saw the world in patterns, a mind her elementary school principal once described as unnervingly gifted. She took the last open seat, front and center, not because she wanted attention, but because she couldn't see the whiteboard well from the back rows. A few students exchanged glances. One boy leaned over and whispered, "Lost," followed by muffled snickers. Neveah heard, but didn't respond. She opened her notebook and waited. Colton entered 5 minutes late, carrying nothing but a marker and his old leather-bound lecture planner. He scanned the room, his gaze pausing just slightly too long on Neveah before continuing. "No introductions. This isn't kindergarten," he began flatly. "You're here because someone, possibly misguided, believed you could keep up." He turned to the board and started writing a set of complex equations, lines of symbolic logic interspersed with Greek letters. The air grew tense. Even the confident students grew quiet. By the time he finished, the whiteboard was packed edge to edge. "This," he said, tapping the final symbol, "is what we will be exploring for the next 8 weeks. If you don't recognize at least 50% of what's on this board, you're in the wrong room." Neveah tilted her head slightly. Her pencil began to move, copying, rearranging, analyzing. The notation was dense, but familiar. Bits of it echoed problems she'd taught herself from YouTube lectures and community college PDFs she found online. She wasn't intimidated. She was curious. Professor Colton turned around. "Who can simplify the second expression?" he asked. Silence. A few students looked down. A few began to slowly flip pages. Colton waited 5 seconds, then 10. Then from the front row, Neveah raised her hand. The room seemed to freeze. Colton's jaw visibly tightened. "Yes?" he said, already annoyed.
Neveah stood.
"You used non-standard notation for the vector function," she said carefully. "But if I'm following correctly, the simplification reduces to the square root of the inverse covariance matrix." A pause, then laughter. One boy guffawed audibly. A girl 2 rows back whispered, "What is she even saying?" Colton didn't smile. He walked to the board and circled the problem. "You think that's the correct answer?" Neveah nodded. He walked back across the front of the class, then without a word erased the entire equation. A stunned hush fell across the room. Neveah's hand dropped slowly. She sat down, cheeks burning. She didn't know if she'd been wrong, but she knew humiliation when she saw it. Colton turned to the rest of the class. "Anyone else?" he asked, as though nothing had happened. That night, Neveah didn't speak during the ride home. Her mother, Neveah Dawson, noticed immediately. "You okay, baby?" Neveah shrugged. "It was fine." Kiara frowned, but didn't push. She had grown up in the same city, in a different decade, but the signs were familiar. A tightness in the shoulders. The practiced silence of a child shrinking herself to fit an unfair space. The second day brought more of the same. Colton posed complex logic sequences. Neveah solved 2 of them, in her notebook, and waited patiently, but was never called on. Once, when she raised her hand a 3rd time, Colton made eye contact, then turned to the whiteboard and said, "Let's move on." The other students noticed, some shrugged it off. Others began to follow Colton's lead, openly mocking Neveah's notebook full of scribbles. "Does it help if you write with both hands?" one girl whispered behind her. "She thinks she's special." Someone else muttered. Still, Neveah didn't stop solving. Numbers were her safety net. They didn't lie. People did. But Colton did more than just ignore her. On the 3rd day, he handed out a pop quiz. 10 questions, rapid fire. Everyone else got 5 minutes. Neveah was given 3. "It's an adapted timing structure," he said blandly. "You'll adjust." She tried her best, but when the time ran out, she'd only answered 7. Her paper came back with a bright red C circled at the top, though her calculations were all correct. Colton had deducted points for clarity and notation sloppiness. When she asked what she could do to improve, he didn't even look up from his desk. "Ask your school to teach you better prep." By the end of the 1st week, Neveah's spark had dimmed. She arrived early, sat silently, and stopped raising her hand. She still solved every equation in her notebook, still filled every margin with ideas, but the chalkboard remained out of reach. Until Friday. It started like every other day, whiteboards filled with formulas, Colton's dry voice, the class barely keeping up. Then midway through the lecture, he wrote a new problem. It sprawled across the board in looping, complex symbols, layered with variables and conditions that didn't appear to connect. "This problem," he said, "is beyond your scope. I'm including it for demonstration purposes only." Neveah blinked. Her fingers twitched toward her pencil. She didn't look around, just stared at the equation. Something about it sparked a flicker of recognition. The structures weren't disconnected. They were recursive. She flipped her notebook open and started writing. Colton moved on, talking through unrelated material. 10 minutes passed. 15. Then Neveah stood up. The classroom stilled. Chairs creaked. Pencils paused. She walked quietly to the board. "What do you think you're doing?" Colton asked flatly. "I think I can solve it," she replied, eyes on the problem. Colton gave a tight, humorless smile and stepped aside. "Be my guest." The chalk felt heavy in her hand. Her heart thundered, but her mind was calm. She began writing. Step by step, line by line, each movement of the chalk unlocked the next. The class watched in stunned silence as the impossible equation began to take shape. Logic unraveling, variables reducing, patterns aligning. When she placed the final mark, the board was full, balanced, solved. A breathless moment passed. Colton walked over slowly. He stared at the board. Then, without a word, he reached for the eraser and wiped it all away. Neveah stood frozen as the last of her work vanished. And in the silence that followed, Colton turned to the class and said, "Let's take a 5-minute break," like nothing had happened. But one student had recorded the entire moment and quietly hit upload. What happens when a teacher decides a black child's intelligence is a threat? Monday came with gray clouds and stale silence. In the aftermath of her erased solution, Neveah walked into the classroom with her eyes lowered, her body language tighter, her notebook clutched even closer to her chest. The whiteboard that had once displayed her genius now sat clean, as though it had never held her ideas at all. No one said a word about what had happened. Not Colton, not the students, not even the assistant professor who had hesitated when the board was wiped. The only trace left was in a quiet corner of the internet, a grainy video clip that no one had yet claimed responsibility for. Professor Colton stood at the front, like nothing had changed. But something cold had calcified in the room's atmosphere. A quiet aggression that didn't need to be voiced to be felt. His eyes skipped over Neveah every time he scanned the rows, and yet Neveah continued what she had always done. She solved every equation, dissected every logic puzzle, and filled her notebook with proofs and annotations no one had asked for. She didn't raise her hand at first, not out of fear, but out of clarity. She had learned the rules of this space. Excellence was not enough, not from someone like her, not in front of someone like him, but by the third question of the morning, her instincts overrode her caution. The problem he presented was a combinatoric sequence tied to a recursive function, something she had practiced endlessly. She knew the answer the way others knew their own names. Her hand went up before she realized. Colton paused, glanced briefly in her direction, then called on a boy 2 rows behind her who hadn't even raised his hand. The boy fumbled his way through half the problem, trailed off, and then Colton gently redirected him with a smile. He praised the attempt, calling it promising, and moved on. Neveah's hand slowly lowered. She didn't show frustration. She didn't blink too long. She simply opened her notebook and wrote the full correct solution in the margin, her handwriting tight with restraint. As the class progressed, it became clear this was no oversight. The same pattern repeated itself. Neveah would anticipate a solution, Colton would ignore her, and someone else would offer a partial or incorrect response, often met with encouragement. It wasn't subtle. It was systemic, calculated, a deliberate decision to erase her presence without ever saying her name. Behind her, whispers began to grow. Soft at first, then sharper. Words like teacher's pet gave way to know-it-all, and math magician, uttered with sarcasm and teenage cruelty. The boys seemed especially invested in the mockery, emboldened by Colton's silence. One even imitated her mannerisms when she wasn't looking, adjusting invisible glasses, miming scribbles, tilting his head in exaggerated concentration. Laughter followed, low and controlled. But Neveah heard it all. She didn't respond. Not outwardly, but her hand, once steady, began to shake. As she turned the pages, she triple-checked every answer before she dared believe it was right. Her margins, once full of exploratory math, were now lined with corrections and second-guessing. She had started to doubt her own brilliance. On Wednesday, everything changed. Colton brought a new problem to the board, a logic riddle pulled from a graduate-level textbook, notorious for being unsolvable with traditional methods. He presented it not as a challenge, but as a showpiece, something meant to dazzle the class and remind them of their intellectual limits. This isn't for solving, he warned them, just for analysis. But Neveah's mind didn't accept limits. While others stared at it in confusion, she began mapping it in her head, searching for gaps, for angles. It wasn't the solution that interested her. It was the structure. The shape of the question itself held a rhythm, a kind of symmetry she couldn't unsee. She worked silently, her eyes scanning from left to right, her pencil moving faster now. The logic tree began to unfold on her notebook page like a blooming flower. Recursive loops interweaving with conditional gates, branching down a path the textbook had claimed, led nowhere. And then it clicked. She saw the contradiction, the self-defeating clause, nestled at the center like a broken hinge. She realized that the problem didn't need solving, it needed reordering. By reframing the initial assumptions, she could dissolve the paradox altogether. Her heart pounded as she reached the final step. She didn't speak. She simply stared at her own work, breath caught between triumph and fear. She had done it, something no one else in the room even attempted. She had untangled the impossible. She raised her hand again. Colton paused, eyes narrowing. For a moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice colder than usual, he told her to explain her reasoning. Neveah stood and began reciting the steps, referencing her notebook only for structure. Her voice was measured, confident. The students who had mocked her now sat frozen, watching something they didn't understand take shape. Her logic was sound, her language precise, her conclusion undeniable. Colton didn't interrupt. He didn't even blink. He let her finish, and then in front of everyone, accused her of plagiarism. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. He asked where she had seen the solution. He demanded to know what website or book she had copied it from. He said the logic was suspiciously mature for a girl her age, and inconsistent with her previous performance, even though her performance had been flawless all week. The air went dead. The class didn't know how to respond. Some looked down, a few glanced at Neveah, then away. Dr. Green, the assistant professor, opened her mouth as if to interject, but then hesitated, unsure of her place in the unfolding accusation. Neveah didn't cry. She opened her notebook and handed it to Colton, wordlessly. He took it, flipped through the pages, barely looking, then closed it and placed it on his desk without a word. He moved on with the lecture as though nothing had happened. The betrayal didn't hit all at once. It settled over Neveah like dust. Slowly. He hadn't disproven her. He hadn't even challenged her logic. He had simply invalidated it with an accusation, one he didn't have to prove, one everyone was too afraid to question. That day at lunch, Neveah sat alone outside the building. She didn't eat, she just stared at the sidewalk, her notebook unopened beside her. A few students walked past, whispering. One girl muttered something about how it wasn't that serious. Another laughed about taking shortcuts. Her hands remained still, her breathing shallow. By the time her mother picked her up that evening, she had stopped speaking. The ride home was quiet until Kiara glanced at her daughter's reflection in the rearview mirror. Neveah's eyes were distant, her shoulders slumped inward like a flower folding into itself. That night, Kiara found her in bed, face buried in her pillow. Her arms were wrapped around the same notebook that had once brought her so much joy. She wasn't asleep, she was hiding. From the questions. From the hurt. From the cruel realization that in this world, being right didn't matter when you were black and brilliant in a room not built for you. She whispered softly into the pillow, voice muffled but firm. She didn't want to go back. Not to the classroom. Not to math. Not to anything. And Kiara, standing in the doorway, realized that her daughter wasn't just hurt. She was on the verge of walking away from the very thing that made her who she was. But in a silent corner of the internet, the video of Neveah's erased solution, the one the world had ignored, had begun to spread, and the storm it would trigger had already begun. Intelligence without recognition becomes a silent scream. The night felt heavier than usual, a deep, slow kind of weight that settled into every corner of the Dawson apartment. Dishes remained unwashed. Lights stayed dim, and in the silence Neveah sat curled at the foot of her bed, arms wrapped around her knees, her notebook unopened on the floor beside her. Her mother, Kiara, sat in the hallway just outside her door. She didn't speak. She didn't knock. She just sat, knees pulled to her chest, head against the wall, listening to the breathing of a child trying to make herself invisible. That silence. It wasn't new. Years earlier, Kiara had heard that same kind of quiet in herself, in the principal's office of her own high school, where a white guidance counselor had looked her in the face and said she wasn't college ready. Kiara had been a straight-A student, with dreams of architecture, but they said her ambition was unrealistic, that she should consider community work instead. Her parents couldn't afford to fight the system, and so she'd let go of her dream and picked up extra shifts at a diner instead. That silence. It had haunted her for years, and now, it echoed in her daughter. But Neveah wasn't just quiet. She was dimmed, dull in a way Kiara had never seen before. Not from tiredness, but from something deeper. Betrayal. Humiliation. That unique flavor of pain that only comes when you give the world your brilliance and it spits it back at you because it doesn't like who you are. The only person Neveah seemed to respond to was her grandfather, Solomon Dawson. He visited the next morning. Retired, 73, with worn hands and a gentle voice that carried the steady rhythm of a man who'd worked night shifts for most of his life. Solomon had been a janitor at Atlanta's Central train station for over 30 years. He never got past 10th grade, but he could still solve long division faster than most people could type it into a calculator. Neveah loved numbers because of him. When she was 4, he'd point to license plates and ask her to add them up. At 6, he taught her how to multiply 5-digit numbers in her head using mental grids. By the time she was 8, they were solving brain teasers together at the kitchen table, their laughter echoing late into the night. To Solomon, math wasn't about status or credentials. It was about rhythm, pattern, harmony. That morning he didn't ask what happened. He didn't need to. He just sat next to her, opened her untouched notebook, and began pointing at one of her older solutions. There were no lectures, no pep talks. He simply traced the lines of her logic, with his finger, slowly, like someone reading Braille. And then he nodded, as if to say, "I see you. You're still in here." Neveah didn't cry, but her eyes glistened. They worked on a logic problem together for an hour. Nothing difficult, just a small puzzle from a Sunday paper. And for the first time in days, her pencil began to move with purpose. Meanwhile, Kiara sat in the kitchen, scrolling through emails on her cracked phone screen. One message caught her attention. A subject line that read, "Concerns regarding Neveah's conduct." It was from the seminar program. The message wasn't long. It was clinical, sterile, and cold, the kind of language designed to protect the sender. It stated that Neveah's recent classroom behavior had raised concerns, and that her engagement style may not align with the collaborative tone we aim to foster. No specifics, no direct accusations, just a passive-aggressive warning cloaked in academic civility. Kiara reread it twice. She saw it for what it was. The first formal step in pushing her daughter out. They weren't just trying to humiliate Neveah. They were trying to erase her. And Kiara had lived that story before. But she had made a decision years ago. On a cold night in a bus stop shelter, while holding infant Neveah in her arms, her daughter would not inherit her silence. Later that evening, Kiara walked into Neveah's room with quiet resolve. Solomon had left, promising to return later in the week. The air smelled faintly of eraser shavings and pencil graphite, the scent of a battle slowly being rejoined. Kiara sat beside her daughter, leaned in close, and told her something she'd never shared before, the real reason she never went to college. How her dreams had been stripped by racism so polite. It wore a necktie. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't ask Neveah to fight. She simply said she believed her. She always had. And if Neveah still loved math, if that fire was still flickering beneath the hurt, then Kiara would stand next to her in that room, every single day, until they saw her brilliance. Neveah said nothing at first. Then, slowly, she picked up her notebook and held it like it was something fragile and precious. She didn't say yes, but she nodded. The next morning, the hallway leading to the seminar classroom was eerily quiet. Other students glanced at Neveah as she walked through, not with overt cruelty, but with that careful, confused stare people reserve for stories they don't fully understand. A few looked away, a few murmured to one another, but none spoke directly to her. What they weren't expecting, what no one was expecting, was the woman walking behind her. Neveah Dawson, in a dark green blazer, no makeup, and an expression like stone. She wasn't there to argue. She wasn't there to plead. She had no words to waste. She was there to be seen. And in racist systems, visibility was a kind of rebellion. As Neveah entered the classroom, she moved quietly to her usual seat. Her notebook landed softly on the desk, her hands folded in her lap. Behind her, Kiara stepped in, not with hesitation but with purpose, and took a position at the back of the classroom. She didn't say a word. She didn't ask for permission. She crossed her arms, leaned against the wall, and stared straight at Professor Colton. The room felt different instantly. The silence sharpened. Colton entered a moment later, pausing when he saw her. For a brief second he faltered, the tiniest hitch in his stride, quickly masked by a tight-lipped smile. But it was too late. The power dynamics had shifted. He stood at the board, marker in hand, pretending the air wasn't electric, pretending her presence didn't matter. But it did. Everything he did now had a witness. He launched into the lesson, but his rhythm was off. He spoke faster, avoided eye contact, scribbled with more aggression than usual. The students picked up on the tension, their eyes darting between teacher and mother. When he asked the first question, Neveah raised her hand. It was the only one. Colton looked at her. A full 3 seconds passed. He ignored her and called on someone else. Kiara didn't move. She just kept watching. But for the first time since the program began, Colton looked small, exposed, and the class knew it too. Something had changed. The balance of silence had broken. What neither Neveah nor Kiara saw, as they left the classroom later that day, was Dr. Green exiting a side office with a printed email in hand, her face pale, her lips pressed tight. The institute had already started internal discussions, not about protecting Neveah, but about removing her. One math problem, one child, one silent revolution in chalk. By the time the 5th day of the seminar arrived, the air in the classroom no longer felt like a space for learning. It felt like a battleground of silence. Neveah had become a ghost with perfect scores. She raised her hand only once that week. It had been ignored. Her classmates no longer whispered insults behind her back. Now they didn't acknowledge her at all. Professor Colton had perfected his method. Omit her, isolate her, erase her. And despite Kiara's quiet presence in the back corner each morning, his tone never softened. If anything, it sharpened. But that morning, something new pulsed under the surface of his voice, a note of provocation. He began by lecturing on real-world applications of complex functions, how certain equations form the foundations of AI, encryption, and atmospheric modeling. The board was covered with formulas, but most of them were academic showpieces, not intended to be solved, just admired. Then he uncapped a fresh marker and paused. With deliberate slowness, he drew a new problem across the board. The notations were dense, layered with dependencies, and surrounded by parentheses that nested like Russian dolls. By the time he finished, the board held a theorem so complex that even Dr. Green tilted her head slightly. He turned around and faced the class. "This is the Gauss-Collins irregularity conjecture," he said. "It's been circulating in academic journals for nearly 20 years. Still unsolved. Still considered unprovable using current logical frameworks." His tone was dry, but his eyes betrayed something sharper. A challenge wrapped in sarcasm. "It's uncrackable," he added, "so don't waste your time, unless you're serious." The last words hung in the air longer than necessary. They weren't meant for the group. They were meant for her. The message was coded, but unmistakable. Neveah understood. Around her, a few students chuckled under their breath. One leaned to another and whispered something, eyes flicking in her direction. But Neveah didn't respond. Her pencil was already moving. She opened her notebook without a word, and began copying the theorem down, not line for line, but structure by structure. Her eyes weren't focused on the symbols themselves. She was searching beneath them, looking for the rhythm, the architecture, the tension between variables that most would miss. Colton continued speaking, but she didn't hear it. The world around her had narrowed into shapes and arcs, silent pulses of mathematical logic connecting across the page. Her hand moved faster. She scratched out dead ends and redrew cleaner paths. She wasn't solving it directly. She was mapping it, bending it, reinterpreting it through an unconventional framework she'd developed with her grandfather. The key was not in solving the core variables. The key was in reversing the conditional dependencies. She could feel it. She glanced up once to check the board again, not for reassurance, but to confirm that what she was seeing in her head was still possible. The rest of the class had stopped writing. One student yawned. Another had begun flipping through a phone under the desk. They had already accepted the challenge as theatrical, a professor's ego trip meant to show them how little they knew. Only Neveah kept going. And then, without asking, without seeking permission, she stood. The motion was fluid, intentional, no hesitation. She walked to the front of the classroom, notebook in hand. The marker was on the tray. She picked it up. Professor Colton watched with eyes that said everything his mouth did not. "You will regret this." But she didn't look at him. She looked at the board. She erased a section in the bottom left, a cluster of conditional paths he had written for effect, but which weren't essential to the root problem. Then she began, line by line, stroke by stroke. Each motion carried certainty, but not arrogance. Her hands moved in loops and branches, rewriting the problem from its periphery inward, deconstructing it like a puzzle she had solved many times before, just in different forms. The room was completely silent. The only sounds were the faint squeaks of the marker and the shifting breaths of students who had never seen her like this. Their ridicule had depended on her invisibility, her silence, her smallness. But here she was, 10 years old, 5 feet tall, hair pulled back in tight braids, solving what they had all been told could not be solved. The solution unfolded like a story. She inverted the recursive functions by isolating the limiting behaviors and proved that the contradiction at the heart of the theorem was not a failure of the equation, but of the assumptions used to frame it. She reframed the axioms. She reweighted the probability sets. And finally, she introduced a symmetry function that, while unconventional, neutralized the irregularity the theorem was built upon. The final line was simple, beautiful, even. She capped the marker and stepped back. The board was full again, but this time with her math. For a moment, the classroom didn't move. No one breathed. Even Professor Colton was still. Dr. Green had leaned slightly forward, eyes fixed on the board like she was witnessing something historic. The stillness was not shock. It was the collective realization that what they had just watched wasn't possible. But it had happened anyway. Colton's face had drained of color. Not all at once, but slowly, like someone watching their carefully built world begin to slide off a cliff. He walked to the board, paused, read it, then reread it. He stood there for what felt like an eternity, and the students waited for his verdict. Some curious, others nervous, a few quietly hoping he'd admit that she'd done something extraordinary. But he didn't. He said nothing. Instead, he slowly reached for the eraser, and without saying a word, began to wipe the board clean. Top to bottom, left to right, every line, every step, every mark she had made. It was as if it had never been there at all.
No acknowledgement, no correction, no feedback.
Just erasure. Erasure as dismissal. Erasure as punishment. Erasure as power. Neveah didn't move. Her hands hung at her sides, markers still gripped in one, notebook in the other. Her eyes didn't well up. She didn't gasp or tremble. But something in her expression cracked. A quiet, invisible fracture that only her mother, watching from the back, could see. Kiara's fists clenched against her chest. She didn't speak either. This moment wasn't hers to interrupt. It was her daughter's battle. But her body burned with fury, a mother's ache sharpened by memory and bloodline. When the last bit of ink disappeared from the whiteboard, Colton turned back to the class as if nothing had happened. "Let's move on," he said. But they hadn't. No one had. Because something in the room had shifted forever. Neveah returned to her seat, and for the first time in the entire program, none of the students looked at her with mockery. They looked at her like they didn't know who she was. Because maybe they didn't. Not really. They had never truly seen her. Until now, what none of them noticed was that the student sitting by the window, the quiet one who rarely spoke, had been recording the entire thing. His phone still running. His screen still lit, and by the end of the day the video would escape the walls of that classroom and begin burning its way through the internet. When your intelligence is denied because it threatens someone's power, the silence that followed Neveah's final stroke of chalk stretched across the room like a drawn wire, thin, fragile, dangerously tense. The board had become a battlefield, covered in her handwriting, the complexity of the problem she had solved. No, unraveled, still hovered in the air like a ghost. No one knew how to name. Professor Raymond Colton moved slowly toward the board. Each step measured, stiff. His eyes darted from one equation to the next, scanning every line she'd written. His expression shivered between disbelief and something sharper, something threat. A few students leaned forward in their seats, hands clasped together, eyes wide. The boy who had been secretly recording lowered his phone only a fraction. Others watched with held breath, fully aware that they were witnessing something extraordinary. Something that felt forbidden. Colton finally spoke, though his voice was flatter than usual. "Cute?" he muttered. "But that's not math. That's guessing." The words cracked through the room, like splintering wood. A few students blinked. One girl frowned, confused at how he could dismiss something so intricate so quickly. Even Kiara, standing at the back with her arms folded, lifted her chin slightly. She watched Colton with the expression of someone gathering evidence with every inhale. Neveah didn't flinch. She stood still beside the whiteboard, hands clasped in front of her, as if bracing herself for another erasure. She'd been erased before. She knew the sound of it. Colton reached for the eraser. But before he could wipe the board clean, Dr. Cassidy Green stepped forward. "Wait," she said sharply. Her voice echoed off the walls. Colton stopped mid-motion. He turned toward her with a slow, exasperated blink, as though she were a bothersome fly that had landed on his shoulder. Dr. Green walked closer, her heels clicking decisively against the tile. She scanned the equations, her eyes widening in ways she couldn't disguise. She reached up and traced a small segment of the solution with her finger. This is actually a valid approach," she said quietly at first, then louder. "Raymond, this might be a breakthrough." She reorganized the conditional dependencies instead of brute forcing the contradiction. "This is sloppy," Colton interrupted. "And wrong." "It's not sloppy," Dr. Green countered. "It's unconventional," and she dismantled the irregularity through a reframed axiom. "That's coincidental," Colton snapped. She stumbled onto a pattern she doesn't understand. Neveah's throat tightened. Her breathing faltered. But she refused to look away, refused to shrink. Dr. Green took a small step toward her. "How did you see this inversion?" she asked. "This isn't something you'd find in a textbook or online. Did someone teach you this structure?" Neveah shook her head gently. "My grandfather," she whispered. "He taught me to look for patterns." Colton huffed a small, sharp laugh that scraped the edges of the room. "A janitor teaching advanced mathematical theory," he said under his breath. "Right." Kira's eyes snapped open wide. Her body stiffened, like a bow pulled taut, but she stayed silent, her expression a mask of unbroken steel. Dr. Green turned her head toward Colton, disapproval settling across her face. "That was unnecessary." "It was accurate," he replied. "No," she said. "It was biased." Colton let out a slow, irritated sigh, ignoring the stares now fixed on him from every direction. The students exchanged glances. A few of them shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One boy near the front muttered, "Isn't the point to solve it?" under his breath, but not quietly enough to be missed. Colton heard him. "We're not here to reward luck," he said firmly. "We're here to establish mastery." He gestured at the board again. "And this, whatever this is, proves nothing." Dr. Green folded her arms. "It proves she's thinking at a level above what most students her age, or even older, can manage. It proves she's guessing," he said, voice rising. "She didn't guess," Dr. Green insisted. Colton snapped. "And you would know that how? You've been here 5 minutes. I've been doing this 25 years. And yet," she replied calmly, "you're the one refusing to examine the solution on its mathematical merit." Her voice cut through the classroom with the precision of a scalpel. Colton's glare sharpened. "Cassidy, you're overstepping." "I'm doing my job," she said. "Evaluating brilliance when I see it." "Brilliance?" he repeated. "This child scribbled a string of half-formed thoughts. And you're calling it brilliance?" The class fell into an even deeper silence. A few students sank lower in their seats, unsure where this confrontation would lead. Dr. Green turned to Neveah again. "Walk me through the final step," she said gently. Neveah hesitated. She didn't want another accusation, another dismissal, another humiliation. But she also knew the shortest path to truth was often the most painful. She stepped closer to the board and pointed to the symmetry function she had placed near the bottom. "If you restructure the irregularity using this weighted inversion," she said softly, "the contradiction dissolves. Instead of treating the axiom as a fixed endpoint, you treat it like a pivot." Dr. Green's eyes widened again. "That's brilliant," she whispered. "That's exactly what current research theorizes, but hasn't proven." Colton scoffed loudly. "Enough. She deserves credit," Dr. Green pressed. "At the very least, acknowledgement. What she deserves," Colton said, with a chilling calmness now, "is to learn the difference between real mathematics and childish experimentation." "Raymond?" "No," he cut in, voice rising. "I won't have this program derailed by a student who doesn't belong here." The words dropped like weights. Kiara inhaled sharply, one hand gripping the strap of her purse hard enough to leave indentations in her palm. Dr. Green stared at him. "You're not just dismissing her work," she said quietly. "You're dismissing her." Colton turned away. "I won't entertain this any further." And then, with a deliberate, almost theatrical motion, he erased the board. The class watched, stunned, some in disbelief, some in discomfort, some in a quiet awe that had nothing to do with respect for him, but with the magnitude of what they had just lost. The room felt smaller, colder, as if the chalk dust falling from the whiteboard carried the weight of something priceless being swept away. Neveah stood frozen, her hands trembling at her sides. Her notebook felt heavier than before, as though it too had absorbed her shame. Dr. Green looked at her with sorrow, frustration, and fierce admiration. "This isn't over," she whispered, but only loud enough for the air to hear, not the room. The remainder of the class passed like a slow march through fog. Colton lectured abruptly, avoiding further examples. The students took notes without conviction. Kiara stayed standing, never taking her eyes off him. When the bell finally rang, the students gathered their things quickly. They shuffled out in clusters, murmuring among themselves. A few glanced at Neveah as they passed, not with mockery this time, but with recognition, fear, respect, confusion.
Maybe all three.
Neveah lingered behind. She felt the weight of something irreversible pressing into her shoulders. Something had happened today that she couldn't name, but she could feel something too large for her to hold. When she finally stepped outside, Kiara placed a steady hand on her shoulder. It was the kind of touch that said both "I'm proud of you" and "I'm terrified for you." They didn't speak on the drive home. They didn't need to. The silence carried everything. But later that night, miles away, in a quiet campus office lit by a single desk lamp, Professor Raymond Colton typed a message with unnerving precision. To department head. Subject: urgent. Student misconduct. Recommendation: immediate removal. He wrote that Neveah Dawson was disruptive, uncooperative, and a threat to the integrity of the program. He never once mentioned her solution. He never once mentioned her brilliance. He never once mentioned the truth. He hit send. And in another part of the building, Dr. Green opened her inbox and froze when she saw a forwarded copy of the same email, with an added note from the department head: "Meet with me first thing tomorrow." One viral clip turned a math classroom into a national outrage. The clip appeared just after midnight on a quiet Tuesday, a shaky phone camera angle, whispering students, the marker in Neveah's hand, the board full of chalk lines, and then the moment when Professor Raymond Colton lifted the eraser and wiped everything away. The recording captured the erasure in slow motion, the chalk dust falling like snow, and the faint gasp from someone in the back row. It lasted only 47 seconds, but the weight of that moment rippled outward in ways the classroom walls could not contain. By dawn, the hashtags #LetHerSolve exploded across social networks. Tweets, Instagram stories, TikTok videos, all featuring the clip and the caption, "Watch what happens when black brilliance meets old institution." The story was uncomplicated and sharp. A black 10-year-old girl solved a theorem considered uncrackable, and a white professor erased it without explanation. News feeds lit up. Headlines announced, "Young genius silenced in advanced math class. Racial bias or academic integrity. The case of the erased proof. LetHerSolve. A classroom becomes a movement." The outrage came not only from online communities but from education advocates, civil rights groups, and social media influencers. Within 24 hours, the clip had been shared over 1 million times. Neveah woke to her phone vibrating relentlessly. Her mother, Neveah Dawson, gently took it from her hand and scrolled. She stared at the screen, her brows furrowed, lips pressed tight. The comments ranged from supportive to outraged. Some wrote, "This is systemic racism in action." Others, "He's protecting his turf," and still others, "This little girl just changed everything." Neveah didn't know whether to be proud or terrified. The world was watching her daughter, and that world could be both beautiful and brutal. Meanwhile, at the institute, the mood shifted. Colton arrived at his office first, the early morning light slicing across the windows like judgment. His inbox already contained notifications, a link to the video, a handful of demands for explanation, an email from the department head asking for immediate comment. He closed the blinds, exhaled, and opened a new draft message. The clip circulating is misleading and out of context. He paused, then deleted the draft and closed the window. In the adjacent faculty lounge, Dr. Cassidy Green sat staring at her computer screen. She watched the clip one more time, this time full screen. Her heart raced. This time she noticed something she hadn't the first time. A timing moment. A student leaning in just before the erasure. The way Colton's hand lingered. The moment had been captured perfectly. She pressed her lips together and reached for her phone. She scrolled through emails. A message from the dean. "Urgent meeting today 2:00 p.m. Attendance required." She glanced at the campus calendar and realized the meeting was closed door. Faculty only. She shivered. Back at home, Neveah sat at the kitchen table. Her notebook lay open, pencil in hand, but she couldn't write. Her eyes kept flicking to the screen of the tablet beside her, where the clip replayed. One comment stood out. "Proof doesn't need your permission to exist." She read it again, and felt something stir inside, a tiny spark of something. Hope, anger, both. Neveah entered the room and sat across. She didn't look at the tablet. She looked at her daughter. "I saw the video," she said softly. Neveah's eyes didn't leave the screen. "Did everyone see?" "Yes," Neveah replied. "And they're not just watching, they're talking." Neveah didn't smile. She didn't cry. She just nodded. While the online rage intensified, the Institute's academic board remained eerily quiet. No statement, no acknowledgement, not even a scheduling note for the public. The silence became its own kind of message, one that echoed in the ears of thousands who watched. At lunchtime in the cafeteria, students clustered around phones and laptops. "Do you see this?" one asked, pointing to the video. "That little girl just solved something decades old," another said. "Why did he erase it? Who erases a correct solution?" The whispers spread like wildfire through the social circuits of the building. Colton ate alone in the faculty lounge, stirring his coffee mechanically, eyes flicking to his laptop. He read comments addressed to him. "LetHerSolve, you erased her because you couldn't face your ego. Bias disguised as academia. She's 10. You're 45. Move aside." He closed the laptop. He sipped his coffee. His expression darkened. Dr. Green found Neveah in the hallway. After lunch, she hesitated a moment, looked at Neveah standing nearby, then leaned in quietly. "You're changing things," she said softly, so only Neveah could hear. "And I'm going to make sure they record what you just did." Neveah turned her head slowly, looked at Dr. Green, then at her mother, then nodded. The bell rang. Class resumed. By the end of the day, a local television crew arrived outside the institute. Cameras, mics, Reporters spread out under the institutional lettering on the building. Students gathered at the windows, their faces pressed to the glass like spectators at a race. Kiara stood beside Neveah, arms linked. A reporter asked a student, "Did you see what happened in there?" The student stared for a moment and said, "She solved it," and then he erased it. It was simple, brutal, clear. Late that evening, Kiara sat with Neveah in her bedroom. The world outside felt like a thunderstorm, flashing alerts, notifications, hashtags, messages. But in her room, the only sound was the hum of the tablet and the distant traffic. "Are you okay?" Kiara asked. Neveah didn't reply. Her eyes were distant. "What do you feel?" "Angry," she said after a pause. "And a little heavy." Kiara placed her hand on her daughter's back. "It's not your fault." Neveah swallowed. "But it feels like mine." Kiara squeezed her shoulder. "They erased your work. They erased your voice." Neveah exhaled slowly. "Then maybe I need to make sure they don't erase me again." Kiara nodded. "We'll fight together." Deep in the Institute's administrative wing, the board assembled in a windowless conference room. The chairs were heavy. The table sat beneath a fluorescent glare that made every set of eyes look tired. Behind them were stacks of printed pages, transcripts, screenshots, student notebooks, legal memos. On the table, the email draft Colton sent glowed on a laptop. None of the board members mentioned race. None admitted bias. Most clung to terms like academic integrity, program continuity, student behavior. The language was safe, legal, neutral. One board member, a woman with silver hair and sharp glasses, leaned forward. "We must protect the institution's reputation," she said. "We must respond, yes, but carefully. We can't open the door to endless claims." Her tone was calm, calculated. Another board member, a younger man, cleared his throat. "The video is everywhere. It's viral. The public perception is now that we silenced a 10-year-old black girl. That narrative is dangerous." Silence hung. Then the chairman, a tall man in his 60s, tapped his pen against the table. "Options?" The room flinched. "What about acknowledging her work and issuing an apology?" one suggested. The chair shook his head. "No. That sets precedent. That opens us up." Another voice, "What if we reassign her? Move her to a lower track?" The suggestion hung like a stink in the room. The chair exhaled slowly. "We convene today, but make no public statement. We will gather more evidence. Meanwhile," he paused, "we must remove the student from the program. Temporarily. Pending review." A hush fell. Another board member scribbled something. The legal counsel cleared his throat. And at that moment the mood of the room changed from deliberation to execution. The decision was made. But there was one detail they all missed in their haste. The live-streamed commentary on the clip had not only reached millions in the US, but been translated and shared overseas. The perception was already global. Back at home, late at night, Neveah's tablet glowed with notifications. One more message came in, from a well-known STEM influencer. "If you're a girl who loves math, and you've ever been told you don't belong, this one's for you." She pressed pause. She looked at the message. She looked at her notebook. She looked at the world outside her window, dark, calm, unspeaking, and she realized the line between math and justice was thinner than anyone thought. The next morning, the board's decision arrived in an envelope, addressed to Neveah, but before she opened it, a knock came at the door. A lawyer stood there. The higher the institution, the deeper the discrimination hides. The envelope arrived just after 8 a.m. A thick manila folder stamped with red ink that read "Urgent, Private." The handwriting on the address label was mechanical, almost cold. Kiara found it waiting on their porch, half tucked under the welcome mat, like a warning no one had the nerve to deliver directly. Neveah was still asleep. She hadn't touched her notebook since the night before. Her tablet lay face down on her nightstand, screen dimmed beneath the pressure of too many headlines, too many strangers cheering her on without knowing the cost. Kiara didn't open the envelope. Not yet. Instead, she placed it on the kitchen counter and stared at it for several minutes, like it might explode if handled wrong. Her instincts told her what was inside. It wasn't just paper. It was permission, or denial, truth, or a carefully packaged lie. That same morning, inside a building, carved from stone and stained glass, the boardroom at the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute was already filled with tension. 10 individuals sat behind a long mahogany table, their suits crisp, their ties tight. Of the 10, 8 were men. All were white. Each held a folder with the same contents. Printouts of emails, copies of Neveah's quiz scores, a screenshot of the viral video, and a preliminary recommendation from Professor Raymond Colton. The only person of color in the room was Dr. Cassidy Green, the youngest by at least 15 years, and the only one without tenure. Her voice had already been interrupted twice. Colton stood at the head of the room. Posture perfect, face unreadable. "I want to be clear," he began. "This is not about race. This is about academic standards. The integrity of this institution must remain unshaken." Dr. Green shifted slightly in her chair, arms folded across her lap. "And what integrity is that exactly?" she asked, voice calm. "Because from where I sit, it looks a lot like we're punishing a student for being too intelligent in a way that didn't flatter our faculty." Colton turned toward her with rehearsed restraint. "She didn't follow proper notation," he replied. "Her work was disorganized. It lacked clarity. She solved an unsolved theorem." Dr. Green fired back. "And the notation wasn't the issue. It was that it came from her." A few of the older board members shifted uncomfortably. One of them cleared his throat. "This isn't about personalities," he interjected. "It's about process. What we allow, what we reward." "But if she were a white boy from a prep school with that exact same solution," Dr. Green said, "we wouldn't be debating this. We'd be rewriting the curriculum around it." Another board member, older and balding, leaned forward. "She disrupted class protocol," he said flatly. "There was no invitation to solve that problem. She asserted herself. She saw the path." Dr. Green cut in. "That's what you do when you're brilliant. You see the door no one else sees." Colton exhaled slowly. "She embarrassed the faculty," he said, "in front of a camera. She took control of a space she didn't earn." "Didn't earn?" Dr. Green echoed. Her voice cracked ever so slightly. "She aced every test. Scored higher than your graduate-level benchmarks. If she didn't earn it, what exactly does a 10-year-old black girl have to do to earn it in this room?" The silence was not surprised. It was calculated, defensive, cowardly. The chairman leaned back in his seat, steepled his fingers, and addressed the room. "We are not here to relitigate the culture wars," he said. "We are here to maintain academic order. This is not about what happened online. It's about how we, as an institution, choose to manage public perception and internal structure." Dr. Green bit the inside of her cheek. She could see the decision already taking shape behind their eyes. They hadn't gathered to deliberate. They'd gathered to execute. Outside, the wind picked up. Just beyond the institute's iron gates, a crowd had begun to form. Neveah's community had shown up. Neighbors, classmates, activists, and parents who recognized the pattern. Some held signs that read, "Black genius belongs. You can't erase truth, and let her solve." A megaphone crackled to life. Someone began chanting her name. The sound carried up the stone walls, but not into the boardroom. The windows were sealed. The voices didn't make it past the doors. Inside, the board continued. One member suggested temporary suspension to de-escalate media attention. Another offered remedial mentorship under Colton's guidance, a suggestion that made Dr. Green's jaw tighten in disbelief. No one asked Neveah what she wanted. No one invited her mother to speak. No one even requested her notebook. Colton's voice, calm and insistent, continued to steer the conversation like a captain in stormy water. "She's young, she'll recover," he said. "What matters is that we don't set a precedent where viral attention becomes a substitute for scholarly discipline." Dr. Green leaned forward, her voice quiet now, tired. "And what happens when she doesn't recover?" she asked. "What happens when we send a message to every gifted black girl, watching that even genius won't protect them in this world?"
No one responded.
The chairman called for a vote. One by one, the hands went up, 8 in favor of removal. 1 abstention. 1 vote against. Dr. Green. The motion passed. Later that day, Colton stood in his office alone, staring out the window at the protesters down below. The signs moved like waves in the wind. He watched them without expression, as though trying to decipher their geometry. Behind him, a printed letter lay folded neatly on his desk. The letter was short. "Dear Miss Dawson, following a formal review, we regret to inform you that your participation in the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute Summer Seminar has been terminated, effective immediately. This decision reflects a misalignment between program structure and individual conduct expectations. We wish you the best in your future educational pursuits. There was no mention of the proof, no mention of the viral clip, no mention of her name spoken in admiration. Just conduct, just misalignment, just silence in formal type. That evening, back at the Dawson home, Kiara finally opened the envelope. Her hands trembled, not from surprise, but from the cruel familiarity of the language. She read it twice before passing it to Neveah. Neveah didn't cry. She just closed her notebook slowly and whispered, "So, that's it." Kiara placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, her voice low. "Not unless you let it be." The sun began to set behind them, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. And then came the knock. Sharp, measured, unmistakably official. Kiara opened the door. A man in a charcoal gray suit stood holding a leather briefcase. He introduced himself with quiet authority. "Marcus Ellington, civil rights attorney." "I saw the clip," he said, "and I've seen enough of these to know when something's broken. If you're ready, we can fight back." Neveah stepped forward, eyes steady. And for the first time since the classroom, she felt seen. But as Marcus unpacked his files on the table, he revealed something no one expected. This wasn't the first time Professor Colton had erased a student like her. She cracked the code, but they still shut the door. The letter didn't even have a signature, just a printed name: Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute, Academic Board. No apology, no justification, no explanation beyond the carefully sterilized phrase, "terminated effective immediately due to curriculum misalignment and behavioral concerns." It read like a warning, a punishment, not for failure, but for daring to win. Neveah read it 3 times before she finally put it down. Her fingers hovered above the paper as though touching it too long might burn her. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She didn't crumble. Instead, she went still. So still, Kiara couldn't tell if her daughter was suppressing rage or simply exhausted. Something had shifted in Neveah's posture. A withdrawal not of fear but of belief. The kind of stillness that comes after you've given the world your best and learned it never planned to listen. Across the table, Attorney Marcus Ellington quietly folded the letter and placed it into a yellow file folder. His eyes scanned the room, the notebook on the edge of the table, the cracked tablet still buzzing with notifications, the single eraser mark Neveah had unconsciously drawn on the corner of the wooden surface with her fingernail. "This isn't the first time," he said softly. "I've seen this pattern before. Academic gatekeeping disguised as policy." Kiara leaned forward, voice sharp. "But this was math. Numbers. Proof. You can't fake that." Marcus nodded once. "And they know it. Which is why they never addressed the solution. Only her presence." Neveah finally spoke. "They didn't say I was wrong. Just that I wasn't right enough." Marcus turned to her, carefully. "They silenced you because you broke their rules without asking. You didn't ask permission to be brilliant." Kiara's jaw clenched. "So what do we do?" Marcus reached into his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder, a compiled dossier of similar incidents at other institutions. He flipped to one page marked "Confidential, Internal Use Only." The document showed redacted notes from a past inquiry into Colton's conduct, involving another student, a black boy age 12 from South Carolina. His name was crossed out, but the accusation was identical: uninvited participation, inappropriate assertiveness, conflict with instructional leadership. That student, too, had been removed without appeal. This document was buried in a settlement from 2019, Marcus explained. No public record, no formal disciplinary action against Colton, but the pattern is nearly identical. Kiara looked at the page, then back at her daughter. "How many others?" "At least 3 that I can confirm," Marcus said, "but this is the first time there's been a recording. And now, the world has seen it." Neveah stared at the document in silence. She didn't need to know those other children's names to understand them. She knew the humiliation of erasure, the sting of being dismissed, not because you were wrong, but because you weren't supposed to be right. Marcus continued. "They were hoping this would stay quiet, that the clip would die off, that the internet would move on. But this isn't going away." Kiara picked up her phone. "So we fight." He nodded. "We go public. Civil action, educational discrimination, institutional negligence. And we name Colton." Kiara's voice dropped. "And the board?" "They'll try to hide behind neutrality," Marcus said. "They always do, but if we show their silence isn't passive, it's policy, we make them complicit." Neveah looked up. Her face was calm, but there was something new in her voice. Steal. Will it change anything? Marcus didn't rush the answer. Maybe not for them, he said, but maybe for the next girl who walks into a room like that. That evening, Marcus began filing the paperwork. The initial civil complaint cited racial bias, academic obstruction, emotional harm, and retaliatory expulsion. It was dense with legal language, but its heart was simple. She solved it, and they punished her for it. The media caught wind quickly. The local news station ran a segment titled "Genius Expelled." School under fire after viral math clip. National outlets followed. Online commentary exploded again. But this time with a sharper edge. Outrage was now pointed, directed, focused. Let their solve evolved into "she was right." Public figures, scientists, educators, even celebrities tweeted support. One said, "This is what happens when black brilliance walks into the wrong room." Another, "She cracked a decades-old problem, and they expelled her. This isn't about math, it's about control." Within 72 hours, the institute was flooded with emails, calls, and press requests. Still, the academic board issued no public statement. The silence deepened their guilt. Meanwhile, Neveah stayed mostly inside. The world outside her window was buzzing, but she moved through her day quietly, brushing her teeth, eating small meals, rereading old equations. But something about her presence was heavier now, more deliberate. She wrote less, solved less, but thought more. One morning, Kiara found her staring at a blank page in her notebook. It had a single equation at the top, but nothing beneath it, just white space. "You okay?" she asked. Neveah nodded. Kiara hesitated. "You don't have to fix everything. Just breathe." "I'm not fixing anything," Neveah replied quietly. "I'm remembering who I was before they tried to erase me." Later that afternoon, the institute made its move. A statement was quietly posted to their website. A short paragraph reaffirming academic standards and behavioral expectations, without naming Neveah or addressing the viral video directly. But the statement backfired. Screenshots of it were shared across platforms with captions like "Translation, we're scared," and "The silence is louder than her proof." Marcus read the statement 3 times. Then he smiled. Not from joy, but because he recognized what desperation looked like in legal form. They were running out of room to hide. He called Kiara immediately. "They're preparing for settlement talks," he said. "Already?" she asked. "They're not worried about the court of law. They're worried about the court of public opinion." Neveah listened from the hallway. Silent. "They want this buried," Marcus continued. "They'll offer money, maybe even a scholarship, but they'll want silence in return." Kiara didn't respond immediately. "We'll see what they offer," she said finally. "But I'm not raising a daughter who signs away her voice." That evening, as the sunset painted the walls in orange and gold, Neveah returned to her notebook. This time she didn't write equations. She wrote something different. She wrote, "Being brilliant in a room that doesn't want you to be is still brilliance." Then she closed the book. The following day, a letter arrived. Another manila envelope. Inside was a formal offer, a scholarship to the Institute's full-year accelerated math program, a press release praising her curiosity and innovation, and a non-disclosure agreement. She was welcome back, but only if she agreed to never speak publicly about the incident again. Neveah stared at the page. So did Kiara. Marcus unfolded the NDA and tapped the final clause. "This is their trap," he said. "They're not offering justice. They're offering silence." Neveah sat with the letter for a long time. Her face gave nothing away. No anger, no smile, just calm calculation. Then she stood, walked to the shredder in the corner of the room, and fed the entire offer through it, piece by piece. Kiara watched in quiet pride. Marcus nodded once. "They'll regret this," he said. Neveah replied, without blinking. "No, they'll remember it." And as the last piece of the letter disappeared into shredded strips, a new email notification popped up on Marcus's laptop. National press request, Neveah Dawson to appear live. When silence becomes strategy, resistance becomes law. He did it from Kiara Dawson's kitchen table, while Neveah sat quietly across from him, reading a thick book on nonlinear systems she had borrowed from the public library. There was no celebration, no dramatic moment of button-clicking triumph, just quiet resolve. The lawsuit named not only the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute, but also Professor Raymond Colton and the board members in individual capacity. The allegations were extensive: racial discrimination, targeted expulsion, academic sabotage, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and systemic bias in advancement practices. Within 24 hours of the filing, a copy of the complaint had been picked up by local news, then national media outlets. One anchor called it a landmark moment for education equity. Another described it as an overdue reckoning for elite institutions that reward conformity over innovation. But for Neveah, it didn't feel like a headline. It felt like telling the truth and daring the world not to look away. "They're going to push back," he said. "They'll claim protocol, policy, maybe even psychological strain." "They'll lie," Kiara added. Marcus nodded. "They'll try to bury the math under the language." "But I wrote it in chalk," Neveah said quietly, without looking up. "And chalk leaves dust." Marcus stared at her for a long second, then smiled. Not wide, not celebratory, but quietly stunned by how clearly she understood the weight of what was happening. Within a week, the Institute's legal team responded. They denied every allegation. They claimed Neveah's removal was unfortunate but necessary, due to ongoing classroom disruption and a pattern of disregard for academic structure. They did not dispute the existence of the video. They did not comment on the solution she had written on the board. They simply reframed the narrative, not as racial bias, but as behavioral incompatibility. It was the kind of language that institutions use to protect themselves. Clean, clinical, plausible to anyone who wasn't paying attention. But people were paying attention. Thousands of them. When the lawsuit went public, the story exploded again. Not because of new footage or shocking revelations, but because of what the complaint named. It used the word that so many institutions feared more than failure: racism. The hashtag "She Was Right" returned to the top of trending lists. Activists began citing the case in education equity talks. Parents from across the country shared similar stories. Black children isolated, dismissed, expelled under vague behavioral codes when they showed signs of brilliance. Meanwhile, Professor Colton went underground. He stopped lecturing. He stopped posting on faculty boards. He issued a single line through his attorney: "I look forward to a fair and impartial review of the facts." But behind closed doors, panic was spreading. Depositions were scheduled. The court ordered production of internal emails, meeting notes, and faculty communications. Dr. Green was subpoenaed and complied without hesitation. Her affidavit was 12 pages long. She confirmed that Neveah's solution had mathematical merit, originality, and pedagogical value. She testified that Colton ignored standard procedures in grading, dismissed Neveah's participation without academic cause, and exhibited clear patterns of gendered and racialized bias during the seminar. She also revealed something else, something Marcus didn't expect. Colton had privately emailed the board after the video went viral, calling Neveah a threat to the intellectual ecosystem of the program, and accusing Dr. Green of emotional over-involvement due to racial proximity. Those words landed like a slap in the courtroom. They were real, written, preserved in metadata. And suddenly, it wasn't just about a math problem. It was about power and fear, and the lengths to which people would go to protect a system built for people who looked like them. The court date was set. The institute hired a high-profile firm known for quiet settlements. But Marcus wasn't interested in quiet. He prepped Kiara and Neveah with long hours, mock depositions, and media training. He knew the public was watching now, and so was the legal community. This was no longer just a case. It was a precedent. 3 days before the trial, a black car pulled up outside the Dawson apartment. A man in a tailored gray suit stepped out, holding a sealed envelope. He introduced himself as a representative of the institute's legal team. He said they were offering a full settlement, 6-figure, a formal apology, an honorary award from the board, and a full-ride scholarship to any STEM-focused private academy of Neveah's choice. Kiara listened. Marcus read every line. Then he flipped to the back page, where the conditions were listed. There was only one. Neveah had to sign a non-disclosure agreement. She could never speak about the institute again. Never discuss the video. Never mention Colton.
Never claim discrimination. Not publicly, not privately, not in interviews, not in future lawsuits.
Her truth would be traded for silence. They called it resolution. Marcus looked at Neveah. "It's generous," he said carefully. "But it's a muzzle." Kiara's eyes darkened. "They want to buy her voice." Neveah looked down at the paper. She stared at the clause that would bind her to their silence forever. She tapped the line with her finger. "What happens if I don't sign?" she asked. "They'll fight," Marcus said. "They'll try to discredit you." Try to delay the case. You'll be in court longer, on the news longer, under pressure longer. Will I win? Marcus paused. I don't know, he said honestly, but the truth is already out there, and they know it. Neveah nodded once. Then she turned to the man in the gray suit and said calmly, clearly, tell them no. The man blinked, surprised. He opened his mouth, then closed it. Then he left. No reply, no protest, just exit. That night, Neveah stood at her window, looking out at the city. Lights flickered like signals from faraway places. Places she hadn't seen, but now imagined. She thought of the classroom, the silence, the erasure, the board, the letter. The moment her chalk touched the board and made something real, something permanent. She didn't want their apology. She wanted change. The next morning, Marcus received an email from the opposing counsel. No subject.
No greeting.
Just a single sentence. We'll see you in court. What none of them knew yet, not even Marcus, was that a leaked internal memo from the institute had just surfaced online, revealing the board's early plan to discredit Neveah's mental fitness if the story ever reached court. Some voices are too powerful to silence. The man in the gray suit hadn't even pulled out of the neighborhood before Kiara ripped the offer letter from the table and read it again. The printed congratulations at the top felt grotesque. It opened with flowery language about Neveah's exceptional curiosity, her impressive initiative, and the promise she had shown during her time in the program. But buried beneath that praise was a wall of legal restrictions designed to erase the truth. Again, the NDA was meticulous. It forbade public comments, media interviews, blog posts, even private discussions with future educators. Neveah couldn't talk about her expulsion, the racial bias, or the moment her solution was wiped away. Not to friends, not in college applications, not in scholarship essays, not even years later. The scholarship was full ride. The money was real. The offer came with a fabricated narrative, but a comfortable one. One the board hoped she would take in exchange for disappearing from the spotlight. Marcus Ellington had seen offers like it before. So had Kiara. But this time, the offer wasn't just trying to rewrite history. It was trying to bury a legacy before it even began. Neveah sat at the edge of the dining room chair, silent, her fingers pressed flat against the wood grain of the table. She hadn't touched the paper. She didn't need to. Kiara asked the question softly, without pushing. What do you want to do, baby? Neveah didn't blink. I want them to hear me. The room went still. No wind outside. No traffic. No phone notifications. Just the breath of three people who understood that once you turn down silence, you step into a storm. Marcus nodded, as if to say, then we fight louder. By rejecting the NDA, they had refused the institution's final attempt at control. That rejection changed everything. It meant the court date couldn't be avoided. It meant discovery wouldn't be sealed. And it meant the board's internal communications, faculty memos, and early meeting transcripts would now become part of the public record. The legal firm representing the institute pivoted. They shifted from offers to tactics. They began sowing doubt through strategic leaks, whisper campaigns suggesting that Neveah had struggled to adapt to the pressures of elite programs. Anonymous comments began surfacing online. Blog posts from supposed alumni mentioned brilliant but unstable students, without naming her. The old playbook, turn the gifted child into a fragile one. Marcus saw it coming. He printed out one blog post and laid it on the table beside the now shredded offer. They're floating a mental fitness angle, he warned. They want to suggest she's too sensitive, too young, too emotionally volatile to be credible. Kiara's face darkened. They want to pathologize her voice. They've done it before, Marcus said. It's a deflection. If they can't disprove the math, they'll attack the math maker. Neveah stared at the headline. It didn't hurt this time. It didn't surprise her. It felt inevitable. They think I'll break, she said. Marcus looked at her. Will you? She looked up, finally. Only their silence. Meanwhile, preparation for the hearing intensified. News crews gathered outside the courthouse in downtown Atlanta. Camera vans with long antennas lined the sidewalk. The courthouse PR office issued warnings to staff about high-profile media attention. Protesters showed up, this time carrying enlarged printouts of Neveah's erased solution, laminated like art. One held a banner that read, "Her silence was the curriculum." Inside Marcus's office, case materials were stacked in organized towers. Every email, every policy document, every testimonial, Dr. Green's affidavit sat at the top of the primary folder, marked with a yellow tab labeled Key Witness. The most damning discovery, however, came from a former intern who had worked in the board's administrative wing. The intern, white, 19 and terrified, had reached out to Marcus anonymously. She didn't want fame. She didn't want credit. She just wanted to sleep again. Her email read, "I saw the early drafts of the board's internal memo. There was language about positioning Neveah's behavior as emotional instability. They were discussing strategy before they even reviewed her work. Please protect my identity." Marcus met with her privately, off record. She confirmed everything. The memo had included talking points about narrative shaping and the risk of letting unfiltered student voices dictate public perception. She said Colton had used the phrase containment before confession in one closed-door meeting, a phrase that now sat highlighted in Marcus's notes, underlined 3 times. It was all falling apart for the Institute, but the pressure was growing for Neveah too.
Not from the media.
From herself. She'd been thrust into a war before she ever had a chance to grow. Her face was now printed in magazines. Her name was quoted by activists. She was receiving letters from students she'd never met, telling her they were standing up to teachers now, because of her. But at night when the lights were off, and her mother had gone to bed, Neveah sat awake. Not afraid, but aware. Aware of the weight of being more than just a kid now. One night she whispered into the dark, "What if I mess it up?" Kiara heard it. She stepped into her room and sat beside her. "Then we mess it up together." Neveah leaned her head on her mother's shoulder. "I'm not scared of them," she said. "I'm scared of becoming what they want me to be." "What's that?" "A symbol." Kiara thought about that for a long time. "You're not a symbol," she said. "You're a girl who did something they said couldn't be done. They're the ones turning that into a symbol." Neveah didn't answer, but she slept better that night. On the final day before the hearing, the Institute's legal team made one last move. They filed a motion to restrict media presence inside the courtroom, citing potential harm to minor participants and educational privacy. Marcus pushed back immediately. She wasn't protected when they expelled her. She wasn't protected when they leaked lies. They don't get to invoke privacy now. The judge agreed. The hearing would proceed publicly. And just like that, the stage was set. Neveah would testify. Colton would take the stand. The board's emails would be submitted. The erased solution would be displayed, this time not on a whiteboard, but on a courtroom monitor, projected in front of cameras, reporters, educators, and strangers around the world. That night, Kiara cooked Neveah's favorite meal, macaroni with a touch of hot sauce and roasted vegetables on the side. They ate slowly, quietly, no news, no talking points, just breathing, just family. Marcus arrived late with one final binder, and a single statement, "Tomorrow changes everything." Neveah looked up from her plate. "No," she said, voice calm. "Tomorrow proves it already did." And as Kiara tucked Neveah in that night, the news broke. Colton had been recorded during a closed-door prep meeting, and in the leaked audio he called Neveah a calculated distraction built on skin color. The audio was already spreading. The trial hadn't even begun. A courtroom became a classroom and the world was watching. The courthouse steps were lined with cameras. News anchors in tailored suits reported under umbrellas. Protesters stood behind barricades holding signs that read, "Let Black Brilliance Speak," and "Silence is the curriculum." Inside, security filtered guests through metal detectors while courtroom sketch artists sharpened pencils in anticipation. But the girl at the center of it all walked in quietly. Neveah Dawson, in a navy cardigan and dark slacks, held her mother's hand as they entered. Her expression was still, unreadable. The courtroom buzzed with tension. Not just legal, historical. The nation wasn't watching for a verdict. They were watching to see if a system that had been built to exclude her could ever acknowledge that she belonged. The trial was underway. Professor Raymond Colton sat with his legal team, his suit pressed, face unreadable. If the leaked audio from the prep meeting, where he had called Neveah a calculated distraction built on skin color, had rattled him, he didn't show it. His lawyers had called it selectively edited, taken out of context, and irrelevant to the core academic question. But the damage had already been done. The court buzzed with anticipation. The case opened with Marcus Ellington standing before the judge, laying out the timeline with surgical precision. He framed Neveah's journey not as a tale of injustice, but as a collision between brilliance and bias. He displayed the viral clip, Neveah solving the problem and Colton erasing it, and then walked the jury through the NDA they were offered, the fabricated behavioral concerns, and the internal memo that had outlined a strategy to discredit a child. And then Colton was called to the stand. He adjusted his tie, cleared his throat, and began what was clearly a prepared performance. He denied everything. He claimed the equation Neveah solved had been posed as a theoretical curiosity, not an actual assignment. He said her response had been mathematically interesting but not formally rigorous. When asked if her race played any role in his dismissal, he responded quickly, "Absolutely not. I treat all students equally." Marcus didn't flinch. He let Colton dig himself in deeper. He presented emails from Colton to board members, describing Neveah as a potential disruption to classroom discipline. He showed notes where Colton had referred to Neveah's work as unstructured amateurism. He pulled up testimonies from students who had witnessed Colton praise white classmates for the same kind of uninvited problem-solving Neveah had been punished for. The courtroom shifted. Jurors leaned in. Reporters scribbled faster. But the most powerful moment came when Marcus introduced a panel of 3 independent mathematicians, all with PhDs, none connected to the institute, who had reviewed Neveah's original chalkboard solution. Each testified under oath that her method was not only valid, but innovative. One called it a nonlinear approach that reframed the problem through a recursive symmetry structure. Another said, it was unconventional. Yes, but genius often is. The final expert smiled slightly before stating, her solution may be the seed of a new class of proofs. Colton's face remained stoic, but his hands, resting on the table, curled slightly. Marcus turned to the jury. This is what they erased. Then came the moment everyone was waiting for. Neveah took the stand. She walked up slowly, her shoes clicking softly on the polished floor. The courtroom went silent. Even the judge, who had maintained rigid neutrality all week, watched her more closely now. She sat in the witness chair. Her feet barely touched the floor, but her voice, steady, clear, composed, filled the room. Can you tell the court, he began, what you saw the day Professor Colton erased your work? Neveah nodded once. I saw fear. A murmur rippled through the back row. Marcus didn't interrupt. He let her speak. I saw that I had done something I wasn't supposed to do, she continued. Not because it was wrong, but because it was too right, and it came from me. She explained the logic she used, the way she'd restructured the theorem's assumptions. She talked about her grandfather, and how he taught her to see numbers as movement, not rules. She described the moment the chalk touched the board, how she didn't know if she'd be believed, but she had to try. And what did it feel like, Marcus asked gently, when he erased it? Neveah blinked. Like being told I didn't exist. Silence fell again. The type that wasn't just respectful, it was stunned. Marcus nodded. Then he paused. Would you be willing, he said, to show the jury what you solved that day? Colton's attorney jumped up immediately. Objection. This is a courtroom, not a classroom. Relevance? Marcus turned toward the judge. Your Honor, we are asking a jury to evaluate whether her work was worthy of protection or dismissal. Let her show them. Let her prove it wasn't theory. It was truth. The judge considered. A long pause. Then nodded. You may proceed. A whiteboard was rolled into the courtroom. Neveah stood. She took the marker from Marcus and faced the board like it was the first time, but this time no one would erase her. The courtroom held its breath. She started slow, writing the base equation, then the recursive structure, then the inversion step that reframed the entire problem. Line after line, she rebuilt the logic, not from memory, but from comprehension. Every curve of her handwriting told a story of ownership. She wasn't performing. She was reclaiming. Even Colton looked up. By the time she finished, the board was full again, exactly like that day in the seminar. Only this time, there was no eraser in sight. She turned around, and for the first time since the trial began, the jury clapped. The judge banged his gavel quickly, reminding the courtroom of decorum. But the message had been received. Truth didn't just belong in books. It lived in bodies, in hands, in voices. And Neveah's voice had broken through the silence that once wrapped around her like a trap. Marcus thanked her and helped her down from the stand. Kiera pulled her into a hug the moment she sat down. Colton looked at the floor. His empire of control, built on years of unchecked power, was collapsing, not from rage, not from protest, not even from law, but from chalk, from a girl, from a voice he tried to erase. But as court adjourned for the day, Colton's legal team submitted a last-minute motion. They wanted the jury disqualified, claiming public bias due to media frenzy. If accepted, it would throw the entire case into uncertainty. When a 10-year-old becomes the face of a movement, the courtroom was meant to be quiet. But after Neveah finished writing the last line of her proof, the same line that had been erased months ago, silence didn't return. Something deeper had replaced it. Reverence. The kind of silence that held its breath, not out of fear, but out of awe. Neveah didn't smile. She didn't bow. She simply recapped the marker, placed it on the tray, and turned around. Her eyes met the jury, then the judge, then her mother. She had said everything she needed to without saying a word. But the noise started just outside. It began with a cheer that rose from the crowd gathered on the courthouse steps. News anchors looked up from their scripts. Cameramen turned their lenses toward the street. Hundreds of protesters, parents and students were watching the trial from screens mounted on trucks, projectors aimed at brick walls and phones held above heads. When Neveah completed the final step, they saw it too, and they erupted. On social media, the clip was live-streamed by dozens of attendees in the gallery. Within minutes, it was clipped, subtitled, and shared with captions, like she did it. The system tried to silence her. She taught the system, and this is what justice looks like on a whiteboard. News channels picked it up. Anchors described the moment, like a turning point. A CNN host said, "We are witnessing something rare, the transformation of a child into a symbol, not because she asked to be, but because the world refused to let her be anything less." A prominent mathematician tweeted, "Neveah Dawson's method of proof will be studied in classrooms long after her name is etched into legal precedent." The movement grew legs. But inside the courtroom, the defense team had other plans. Just hours after the emotional high, Colton's lawyers filed a motion to disqualify the jury. They argued that public pressure and excessive media exposure had created an environment where an impartial verdict was no longer possible. The motion claimed that jurors may have been exposed to social media narratives and may no longer be capable of reviewing the case on its legal merits. Marcus Ellington stood to oppose it. "Your Honor," he said calmly, "this is a desperate attempt to derail justice, after truth has already been presented." The jury didn't change. The only thing that changed is the country finally saw what we've been saying all along. The judge read over the motion in silence. The courtroom waited. Then, finally, he spoke. "The court acknowledges the public attention this case has received," he said. "But attention does not invalidate truth. The motion to disqualify is denied." A wave of breath swept across the room. Colton's jaw tightened. He leaned toward his attorney and whispered something low, too low to hear, but his eyes were fixed on Neveah the whole time. The trial proceeded to closing statements. Marcus stood before the jury, slow and deliberate. "She's not just a student," he said, gesturing toward Neveah. "She is what our schools say they want. Curious, driven, brilliant. But she walked into a room that wasn't built for her, and instead of being lifted up, she was erased. And when the world saw that erasure, they didn't just see a teacher and a student. They saw a pattern, a system." He paused, letting the silence sit. "She solved something that others couldn't, and they punished her for it. That's not education. That's control." He stepped back. The defense attorney followed, but his voice was defensive, uncertain. He tried to reframe the issue again, as academic order, not racism, as disruption, not discrimination. But his argument was fraying. The evidence had already painted a story louder than any narrative the Institute could manufacture. When both sides rested, the jury was dismissed to deliberate. Neveah returned to her seat, her hands folded in her lap. Kira leaned toward her daughter. "No matter what happens, they heard you." Neveah nodded once. "I just hope they believed me." The hours crawled. Inside the courthouse, tension simmered. Outside, a crowd grew to over 2,000. Students held up markers in the air, a silent gesture of solidarity. Teachers from across the country flew in to stand beside them. Celebrities tweeted support. Even members of Congress posted messages calling for systemic reform in elite academic programs. This was no longer about a classroom. This was about credibility, about which minds were allowed to lead, and which were quietly cast aside. As the sun dipped lower, a courthouse staffer approached the judge's bench. "The jury has returned." A hush fell across the gallery. Marcus reached for Neveah's hand under the table and gave it a small grounding squeeze. Kira held her breath. The judge called the court back into session. Everyone stood. The jurors filed in slowly, their faces unreadable. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman in a deep burgundy blouse, held the envelope tightly in her hand. She passed it to the bailiff. The bailiff passed it to the judge. The judge read the document silently. The air in the room grew impossibly dense. Marcus closed his eyes for one brief second. Then the judge looked up. "We have a verdict." Every person in the room leaned forward. Reporters steadied their cameras. Protesters outside held hands. Screens across the country showed the live feed. It was no longer just a trial. It was a mirror. One that reflected who we believed genius belonged to. The judge opened his mouth. And just as he prepared to speak, a courtroom official stepped forward from the side door, whispering something urgent in his ear. The judge froze mid-sentence. He looked down at the note in his hand. A new note. Then back at the courtroom. "I've just been informed," he said slowly, "that before we proceed, the court must acknowledge a new piece of submitted evidence that directly impacts this verdict." The room erupted. Gasps, murmurs, tension cracking like glass. "What evidence?" Marcus asked, rising from his seat. The judge gestured for silence. "This court has received a signed affidavit from a former board member at the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute." Marcus turned, stunned. "A former board member?" The judge continued. "The affidavit includes first-hand testimony that Professor Colton actively pressured board members to support expulsion before reviewing any of the students' work, and that he referred to Neveah Dawson as, quote, an anomaly that needs to be handled quietly." The gallery fell into complete silence. Marcus looked toward the defense table. Colton was visibly shaken for the first time. He glanced at his legal team, who looked equally blindsided. The judge set the note down and turned to the jury. "This court must now consider whether to proceed with the current verdict or reopen deliberation to account for this new evidence." Whispers returned. The jurors looked to one another. The judge raised his hand. "Given the weight of this testimony, this court will reconvene in the morning. The jury will be sequestered overnight. We will resume at 9 a.m. sharp." The gavel struck. The session adjourned. Neveah sat frozen in her seat. Not from fear but disbelief. Someone from inside had finally spoken up. And not just anyone. A board member. Kiara reached across the table, her eyes filled with fire. "They're cracking." Marcus nodded. "No, they're unraveling." As they left the courtroom, Marcus's phone buzzed. A National Education Foundation had just posted a public offer, a $100,000 grant in Neveah's name, to start a scholarship for other underrepresented math students. But the top comment read, "Too little too late, when truth finally finds its voice." The morning sun broke across the courthouse steps like a spotlight, casting long shadows over a crowd that had grown tenfold since the trial began. Journalists flanked the sidewalk, their cameras ready, their breath visible in the cool Georgia air. Protest signs swayed gently, no longer cries for justice, but sentinels of anticipation. Inside courtroom 3B, 12 jurors sat quietly in their box. The judge, expression solemn, held the envelope in his hand. This time, there were no interruptions, no whispered notes, no last-minute evidence. The verdict was ready. Neveah sat in the front row beside Marcus and Kiara, her palms flat against the oak bench. She didn't blink, not because she wasn't nervous, but because she didn't want to miss a second. The judge cleared his throat. "In the matter of Dawson v. Georgia, Advanced Mathematics Institute." The world seemed to pause. "The jury finds in favor of the plaintiff, Neveah Dawson." The courtroom erupted. Applause burst like thunder. Reporters dashed out of the room, already phoning in the verdict. Protesters outside screamed in celebration. And in that small, air-conditioned courtroom, a 10-year-old black girl exhaled the breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since her chalk first touched the board. But the verdict was just the beginning. The judge continued reading. "The court orders that the Georgia Advanced Mathematics Institute must publicly reinstate Miss Dawson's academic standing, issue a formal written and televised apology, and allocate $2 million in funding to establish a STEM equity initiative under her name, the Neveah Dawson Scholars Program." He paused. "Furthermore, the court orders Professor Raymond Colton to resign from all educational duties at the institution, effective immediately." Colton didn't speak, didn't protest. He simply stood, adjusted his tie, and walked out of the courtroom through the side door, the same one used for witnesses, not educators. The silence behind him was heavier than any gavel. Marcus turned to Neveah, voice low. "You did that." Kiara leaned in, a single tear sliding down her cheek. "No, baby," she said. "You rewrote the rules." But the changes didn't stop in the courtroom. By that evening, the Institute's official website posted the full apology, not a PR-flavored statement, but a formal signed letter admitting institutional failures, racial insensitivity, and complicity in academic erasure. It went viral. Again, only this time, no one asked whether Neveah was the real deal. They knew. Her proof was on record. Her words were archived. Her courage was printed in ink and pixels. Then came the headlines. Justice for Neveah. Black girl genius wins against system that tried to erase her. From expulsion to example. How one student changed the game. And tucked between those headlines came news that sent ripple effects through the academic world. Dr. Cassidy Green had been promoted to Program Director of Advanced Mathematics. Her first act? Expanding the summer seminars outreach to historically excluded schools and removing the behavioral probation clause from student participation requirements. She called it the Neveah Clause. 3 weeks later, Neveah stood on a stage in Washington, D.C., holding a medal nearly the size of her palm. She had been named the youngest recipient of the National Mathematical Youth Innovator Award, a title normally reserved for high school seniors, not fourth graders. The audience stood as she walked to the podium, her speech clutched in slightly trembling hands. She looked out at a sea of faces, scholars, scientists, educators, children. "I never wanted to be famous," she began. "I just wanted to be heard." She paused. "They tried to teach me I didn't belong. But numbers don't lie, and now neither can they." The room thundered with applause. But even as the world celebrated her, Neveah knew something else was coming. Every gain has a price. Every spotlight casts new shadows. And when the applause faded, a new letter arrived. This time it wasn't a threat. It was an offer. The Stonebrook Preparatory Academy for Gifted Youth, one of the most prestigious academic prep schools in the country, had extended her an invitation. Full scholarship, access to collegiate-level math courses, private labs, an education pipeline that led directly to Ivy League universities. On paper, it was everything Neveah had once dreamed of. But dreams aren't built on paper. They're built in people. And the people at Stonebrook, at least some of them, had already made their opinions known. The headmaster's letter was warm, welcoming, flawless in grammar and tone. But a separate email, not meant to be forwarded, somehow landed in Marcus's inbox. An internal thread between two board members at Stonebrook. One line stood out in bold. "She may be talented, but we don't want activists on campus, especially ones with a following." And just like that, Neveah understood. Some doors didn't close. They just opened into new cages. Marcus called an emergency meeting that night. Kiera sat across the table, the offer letter in one hand, the printed email in the other. She looked torn, proud, protective, furious. "They want her name," she said. "Not her power. They want the glow," Marcus added. "Not the fire." Neveah stayed quiet. She was older now, not in years, but in edges. Her voice had weight. Her silences had shape. "I don't want to start over by shrinking," she said finally. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "You're saying no?" "I'm saying," she looked out the window, "if I'm going to walk through another door, I'm walking in as me. All of me." Marcus folded his arms. "Then we negotiate. Not just a seat. A voice. Oversight. Protections." But Kiera was less patient. "What if it's just another place waiting to erase you again?" Neveah turned to her. "Then I'll write louder." But as the family prepared to respond to Stonebrook's offer, a second envelope arrived by courier, this time from a major tech company. It wasn't about school. It was about something else entirely. They wanted to hire Neveah, not as a student, but as a consultant. Even when she proved herself, new walls kept rising. The gates at St. Virgil's Prep Academy swung open like a promise. Opportunity, excellence, legacy. The stone buildings loomed with history. The classrooms smelled of oak and old money. Every hallway carried echoes of alumni who had gone on to become CEOs, surgeons, senators. Neveah Dawson stepped onto campus with a scholarship, a national award, and the weight of a revolution at her back. But prestige doesn't erase prejudice. It just teaches it to smile. From day one, Neveah noticed the difference. This was not the blatant dismissive bias of Professor Colton. No one here rolled their eyes or muttered slurs. No one questioned whether she belonged, at least, not direct. Here, the racism was refined, dressed in neutral tones, hidden behind policies wrapped in polished compliments that sounded like praise but landed like bricks. Let's make sure she's really challenged. Translation. Let's retest her. Just want to be certain she's not burning out. Translation. Let's evaluate her mental health again. We'd love for you to prove your placement again, just to track your growth. Translation. Your first success must have been luck. Neveah took every extra test they threw at her and aced them, but they kept coming. Every evaluation was framed as care. Every delay in her course advancement was packaged as protecting her development. They placed her in a math class 2 levels below what she was qualified for, citing curricular consistency. When Marcus questioned the decision, the head of academics responded with a polite email full of doublespeak and 0 commitments. So Neveah did what they didn't expect. She created her own curriculum. She stayed after hours in the library, scanning textbooks, 3 years ahead. She built her own problem sets. She submitted optional papers to professors who had nothing to do with her courses, and started earning quiet recognition from faculty who weren't part of the inner circle. But the student body had its own version of exclusion. She wasn't bullied. No one shoved her into lockers or hurled names. But she wasn't invited, either, to study groups, to team projects, to lunch tables. When group assignments were announced, a brief silence always followed, a pause where eyes searched for options other than her. And when teachers finally assigned her to a group, her classmates smiled tightly, then ignored her ideas until they needed answers. She wasn't invisible. She was untouchable. Brilliant. Yes. But inconvenient. Her name was too loud. Her presence too political. Her chalkboard moment too recent. Some whispered that the school only accepted her because of the media attention, that her win against the institute had been a PR decision, that she was a figure, not a student. Neveah heard it all. She just didn't bend this time. Instead of shrinking, she started mentoring younger students who looked like her. She held quiet meetups in the library, on Saturdays, solving logic puzzles, teaching shortcuts, helping kids navigate systems that had been built to test them, not teach them. She didn't fight to fit in. She fought to stand out. When St. Virgil's announced its annual Inter-Academic Math Challenge, a prestigious competition judged by external mathematicians and alumni, Neveah entered immediately. She submitted a project titled Invisible Structures, Rethinking Patterns in Nonlinear Proofs. It wasn't flashy, but it was original, and it was bold. The night of the event, students filed into the lecture hall, dressed in polished uniforms. Parents sat in the back, sipping coffee from branded cups. The judges, all white and over 50, wore navy blazers and nodded along as projects were presented. Neveah was last. She walked up, adjusted the mic, and began with no preamble. "I don't want to prove I'm smart," she said. "I want to prove there's more than one way to be right." The room hushed. She moved through her presentation with clarity, building from foundational logic to advanced transformations. She didn't smile much. She didn't perform. She taught, with precision, with patience, with command. When she finished, polite applause followed. Nothing thunderous. Nothing wild. Just enough. An hour later, the judges announced the winners. Neveah placed first. No surprise. Her name was already buzzing. Even her quietest critics knew she'd earned it. But after the crowd began to thin, as she gathered her materials and tucked her binder beneath her arm, she heard it. A whisper from behind the judges' table. Must have been political. Her spine stiffened. She turned slowly. One of the older judges, a retired alumnus with slicked back gray hair and a subtle smirk, was speaking to another juror, unaware or perhaps unconcerned that Neveah was still within earshot. "I mean, she's good. But let's be honest. They had to give it to her." Neveah stepped forward. Not rushed, not angry, deliberate. She stopped 2 feet from him and looked directly into his eyes. "If you think I didn't earn it," she said calmly, "I'm happy to prove it again. Publicly." He blinked. "I beg your pardon?" "A rematch," she said. "You pick the problem. I'll solve it. In front of the student body. In front of faculty. In front of the same people you just disrespected with that whisper." The judge chuckled nervously. "That's not how this works." "It is now," she replied, "unless you'd rather just keep whispering." His expression shifted, surprise turning into discomfort, then into something more careful. She didn't wait for a response. She walked away. By the next morning, word of the confrontation had spread. Students buzzed with speculation. Teachers whispered in corners. Some called her bold. Others called her reckless. But the administration couldn't ignore the story, especially once students began petitioning for the rematch to be held as a formal exhibition. And then, the twist came. The judge accepted, sort of. He issued a challenge, posted formally through the school's bulletin. Ms. Dawson's talent is undeniable. I welcome a collaborative demonstration of advanced problem solving with her. To honor the intellectual rigor of St. Virgil's, it was framed in politeness, but everyone knew what it really was. A test. Again, Neveah didn't flinch. She accepted within the hour. Kiara was hesitant at first. You don't have to prove yourself again. You already changed the world. Neveah smiled gently. I'm not proving myself. I'm showing them they're not done learning. That night, as she prepped for the rematch, she laid out 2 notebooks side by side, one filled with equations, the other empty. What's the second one for? Kiara asked. For whatever comes next, Neveah replied. But as Neveah began practicing for the exhibition, a faculty member quietly warned Marcus. The judge wasn't just trying to discredit her on stage. He was planning to challenge her using a proof she'd never seen, one that hadn't been released in public domains. A trap masked as fairness. Brilliance cannot be silenced when it becomes a symbol. The lecture hall was standing room only. Students balanced on windowsills, teachers leaned against walls, and cameras angled from the back row like sentinels. The rematch wasn't a formality anymore. It had become a spectacle, not for entertainment, but for vindication. Neveah stood at the edge of the stage in her navy blazer, holding a single white marker. Across from her was Walter Griggs, older, composed, but visibly aware this was no longer just a display of logic. This was legacy. He'd tried to trap her with a challenge crafted in private circles. Now, the entire country was watching to see if brilliance could outmaneuver bias. The room went silent. The problem, abstract, sprawling, almost intentionally obtuse, was already on the board. Griggs had presented it first, framing it as a collaborative demonstration. But everyone knew what it was. A test. Neveah stepped up. She stared at the equation. Long pause. Then she did what no one expected. She picked up the marker and erased the problem. Gasps. Then, in clear, deliberate strokes, she rewrote it. Simplified, clarified, humanized. Her reformulated version stripped away the elitism. It kept the heart of the logic, but made it accessible. Then she began solving. Each line she wrote wasn't just correct. It was graceful. Every transformation, every proof, every recursion was presented with clarity that even first-year students could follow. She narrated not with arrogance, but with purpose. Then she paused. She turned to the audience. Brilliance, she said, is not how fast you solve, it's how deeply you understand, and how boldly you reshape the rules that tried to exclude you. She turned back to the board and wrote one final sentence across the bottom, in clean capital letters. Black girls don't need permission to be brilliant. The room exploded. Reporters rushed to upload the clip. Professors stood and clapped. Students roared. Some cried. Some held their phones up like torches. Walter Griggs didn't interrupt. He didn't argue. He walked to the board. He studied her solution quietly, finger trailing the mirrored logic branches. One traditional, one original. Then he faced the crowd and spoke simply. She's not just right. She's redefining what right looks like. The next morning, the clip had more than 14 million views. Redefine Genius trended across every major platform. Talk shows ran segments on Neveah. School boards began publicly reevaluating how they placed and treated students of color in advanced programs. And across the country, a wave of conversations started, not just about math but about visibility, access, and brilliance. And then came the letters. Thousands of them. From girls. Most of them black. Many of them just like Neveah. Handwritten. Emailed. D-made. Messages that carried hope, heartbreak, and something new. Power. You made me believe I could be more than quiet. I solve in notebooks now. Because of you. My teacher saw me today. Because she saw you. Neveah sat on her bedroom floor, surrounded by envelopes. Some were messy, scribbled with crayon. Some were typed perfectly. Some included drawings of her with capes, chalk, or crown. She wasn't just a girl with a gift anymore. She had become something bigger. A symbol. A shift. And as she opened the last envelope, a square white one postmarked from Cambridge, her fingers froze. Inside was a single embossed sheet. Harvard University Department of Mathematics. Summer Youth Innovation Consultant. Invitation. They weren't inviting her as a student. They were asking her to teach, to advise, to shape the next generation of curriculum and equity design. Harvard had seen what the rest of the world now understood. She wasn't just exceptional. She was historic. Neveah looked up from the letter, and in the reflection of her bedroom window she didn't see a child anymore. She saw the girl who had rewritten the rules. If you've ever been overlooked, silenced, or told you didn't belong, you already know what Neveah felt. No child should have to fight this hard just to be seen. Type yes if you believe brilliance has no color. Subscribe if this broke your heart.